Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're on to step 7 of the Blockhead build. We're building the front arms. We need 2 M3x3 grub screws, 2 4mm brass ball ends, 2 3x20 shafts, 2 uprights, and E7 and 8 the front arms. First we'll install the ball ends into the outer holes on the uprights. They should just thread in, but they can be a bit difficult to get started. If it's a bit of a struggle, you can use a screwdriver to slightly round off the edges of the holes. Press firmly and spin the tip of the driver back and forth a couple of times. Now the ball end should thread straight in with no fuss. Keep in mind the threads are small and very short, so there's not much to bite into the plastic. We need to be extra careful not to over tighten them and strip them out. Also, don't forget to make a left and a right-handed upright. Next we'll thread the grub screw into the holes in the back of the uprights. This is metal on metal, and once assembled they will be quite tricky to get at, so we're going to use a tiny bit of thread lock. We only need a trace of it on the threads before we screw the grubs in just a turn or so they won't fall out. Now we can slide the appropriate upright into its arm, remembering the left and right are different. Pop the shaft in so it's even top and bottom, then we just tighten up the grub screw. And when we've done 2 of them, that's the arms built. A super simple assembly. Step 8, fitting the arms to the chassis. All we need this time, of course we need the arms, 2 M4 flange nuts, which are wheel nuts, and the chassis. All we do for this one is slide an arm onto the shaft at the front of the chassis, remembering to pick the right one for the right side, and we thread on a nut. You should be okay tightening the nut all the way down until it stops. The arm should flop around completely freely, but due to tolerances and fits you might find the arm is slightly stiff. If so, loosen the nut ever so slightly until the arm is no longer bound up. With both arms on, that's step 8 complete. Step 9, the front dampers. We need lots of bits for these. 4 2mm E-clips, 2 silicone O-rings, the clear ones, 2 pistons, 2 shaft guides, 2 brass rod guides, 2 5mm rod ends, 2 damper shafts, and the 2 damper bodies which we need to take apart. You should end up with 2 top caps, 2 bodies and 2 bottom caps. The dampers are pretty standard assemblies, so there's not really any surprises. Right, first step is to fit the pistons to the shafts. We do that by clipping in an E-clip into the lower slot with some pliers. Slide on the piston and clip in another E-clip in the top slot to secure it. Make up 2 and they're ready to go. Next we pop the shaft into the damper body so the threaded end passes through the bottom hole. Now before we slide on the O-ring, we need to lubricate the threads with some of the damper oil. We need to be super careful not to damage the inside of the O-ring. Any small scuff will lead to a leaky damper. After the O-ring we have the plastic shaft guide, then the plastic rod guide with its narrow end towards the bottom. To make sure it's fully lubricated, we'll also put a couple of drops over the parts to make sure nothing catches and they seal up. Then we gently press the parts into the bottom of the damper and we thread in the bottom cap. Do it up as tight as you reasonably can by hand. There shouldn't be any need to use any extra leverage. Next we have the rod end, but before we go and grab the shaft with some pliers, we need to use a little bit of cardboard to protect it. If we score or scrape the rod, it's going to eat the O-ring in no time and we're going to end up with a leak. Be careful and thread on the rod end. Rinse and repeat, and we've got 2 dampers ready to fill with oil. Step 10, the damper oil. The only bits we need, other than the dampers and the top caps, are the 2 oil seals, or as they're more typically known, the diaphragms. When filling, it's a good idea to wrap the damper in some paper towel. The chance of overspill is quite high if you're not sure how much to add. Initially, we fill the damper to 2mm or so below the top. Then we slowly pump the shaft up and down a few times to release the air from under the piston. The included oil is thin enough that the air floats up very easily. Now we can top up the oil. Now I'm going to fill it so it's just below the top to take into account of the diaphragm. However, this isn't quite following the manual. Next, the diaphragm sits on the top of the damper, and if we were following the manual, we'd run the shaft up into the damper to displace some oil, then fit the cap. I'm going to be slightly different though, and fit the top cap with the shaft down, leaving it a little bit loose. You should start to feel the thread start to stiffen as it comes into contact with the diaphragm. Then we slowly press the shaft into the damper. We should get a little bit of oil work its way through the threads. Gently work the shaft up and down a couple of times, then hand tighten the cap fully. We should end up with a very smooth action, and at rest the shaft should be fairly neutral. It's worth noting different types of damper like to be built in different ways. Also, there's quite a few methods that will also end up in a nice smooth damper. This is just how I deal with this type. Step 11, springs. This time we need 2 M3x15s, 2 M3 nylock nuts, 2 rubber damper bushings, 2 spring retainers, 2 small brass tubes, 2 springs, and the 2 suspension trays. To fit the springs, we just slide them over one of the dampers, pull the spring back, and slide in a retainer so it fits over the rod end. Same goes with the other one, of course. Next, we need to squeeze the rubber bushings into the hole in the top caps. They take a little bit of work to get them through, but it's quite doable without using any tools that might just risk damaging the rubber. At the bottom, we need to pop one of the brass tubes into a rod end, then slide it into one of the stays. And then we follow it with a screw and a nut. Check against the diagram that you get the screws and the nuts on the right sides of the stay. We need to end up making one left and one right-handed assembly. Step 12, fitting the dampers. Right, we need 2 M3x18s, 2 3x12 self-tappers, 2 M3 nylocks, a single 3mm washer, 2 3x1.5 aluminium spacers, 2 brass round bushings, and a large silver body mount. Then there's the dampers and of course the chassis. We'll start with the body mount. We need to slide the washer over the threads and screw it into the post moulded into the chassis in the middle right at the front. We need to set it so the hole for the body clip is right across the chassis. It's quite doable with the kit cross wrench, but it can be fairly stiff, so a proper 5.5mm nut driver does help. To fit the dampers, we're going to start at the bottom. We line up the stays on the arms so the lower screw heads are on the outside. Then we thread in one of the self-tappers to attach it. At the top, we slide one of the brass bushings into the rubber bushing from the inside. Pop one of the M3 screws in from the outside, and we add one of the aluminium spacers over the threads. Then we pass the threads through the damper mount, and we add a nut. Tighten it up, and that's the damper mounted. Do the same on the other side, and that's the 2 dampers mounted. A super simple setup, but it should work just fine. I'd much rather the dampers had 2 O-rings stacked up in the bottom cap, but we were super careful during assembly, so we should be okay. Step 13, rear suspension shafts. We need 8 3x12 self-tappers, 2 steel rear suspension shafts, E5 and 6 the mounting blocks, G14 and 15 the silver cage end bits for the battery bay, A11 and 12 the silver end plates, and when we notice it's missing, we need G3, the spacer that goes between the mounts. The manual wants us to grease up the shafts, but that's going to make a right mess as we continue the build. So rather than grease the whole lot, we're just going to add some under the heads before we slot them into the mounts. When we get to fitting the rear arms, we'll just add a bit more grease. We can just fit the first mount to the chassis with 2 of the self-tappers. Then, before we fit the second mount, we need to add G3 between them, which holds the shafts in position. A slightly odd setup, but nothing too outrageous as far as classic Tamiyas go. The end bits of the battery bay are nice and simple. We just slot the cage part onto its plate, remembering they're sided of course, offer it up to the side of the chassis and install the 2 screws. The only tricky bit is you can't really get straight onto the screw heads, so take extra care not to slip. Do both, and that's step 13 complete. Step 14, the gearbox stays. We need 1 M3x18, 1 3x12 self-tapper, 1 M3 plain nut, 3 3mm washers, one 3x1.5 aluminium spacer and a large body mount. For plastic, we need two G10 gearbox mounts, or stays. Just like at the front, we need to install the body mount with its washer first to get it out of the way. It goes in a post under the chassis at the rear in the middle. Also, just like the front, we need it so the body clip hole runs across the chassis. To make things a little more confusing than they possibly could be, in the diagram the chassis is upside down, and the first screw for the gearbox mount goes in from the top. So to make it a bit clearer, we'll have the chassis the right way up in the video. The gearbox mounts have a tab that fit into a slot on the chassis for alignment. The left mount uses the self-tapper and a washer to attach. Thread it all the way in so it's snug, plus a little extra tweak. The right hand mount is a little bit different. We use the long M3 screw from under the chassis. We need to thread it in all the way so the screw head is tight against the plastic. It takes a little while to thread it all the way in, especially by hand. If you're going to use an electric driver, watch out for the heat building up due to friction and melting the plastic. Right, then from the top we drop on the mount, then a washer, followed by the spacer, and then a nut to hold it all together. On the face of it, this does seem like a rather strange thing to do. Why not just two of the self-tappers? But the exposed thread is there, so the antenna/flagpole that we fit later has something to mount to. Step 15, cage assembly. We need the aluminium shaft with the M3 holes in the ends, and the two cage parts. Now the cage has some steel threaded bits moulded into it for mounting. We need to thread the aluminium shaft onto the top thread. We start by attaching it to one side, then we just spin the other cage half onto the other end. Fairly simple, just don't over tighten it. It's just possible you could pull the steel bits from the plastic. I'd hope Tamiya would have thought of that though, but you never know, and there's no real need to test it. Step 16, attaching the cage to the chassis. Now I make a bit of a mistake in this step that I don't notice until right at the end of the build. Another one of those late night building issues. Anyway, we need two M3 flange nuts, two small body mounts, the cage and the chassis. It's easiest to fit the body posts before we put the cage on. They just screw into moulded posts in the chassis. Just make sure you get the right post though. The diagram clearly has the body post going in just to the rear of the battery bay, but for some reason I happily fitted them right near the front of the chassis. The thing is, they look perfectly reasonable there. It's only when you come to fit the body that they're obviously very, very wrong. So for the time being, the body posts are going to be up front. As for the cage, it's just a case of popping the lower threads through the holes in the chassis, and then threading on the nuts and nipping them up. It's going to be a bit wobbly for now, but as we build up the rear, it's going to become far sturdier. We just need to be a bit careful until it's properly mounted. And that's going to be step 16 complete and bag A finished. With the cage on, it's really starting to look like something. So far, other than the last two body mounts, it's been a rather nice build. Next time we'll make a start on bag B and see how far we get. It focuses on the rear end, so we've got the gearbox and the suspension to put together. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!